Good morning and welcome to the Institute for Security Studies, where today we'll discuss the global lessons on migration. I am Otilia Anna Maunganidze and I head special projects here at the Institute for Security Studies. As I imagine most of you already know, migration is a very topical issue, not least here in South Africa, where the issues around the role that immigrants play, whether positive or negative, has come to the fore in various party policies, and where the idea of having an inclusive society is really in many ways informed by how best or how can we properly integrate people that have migrated into South Africa to settle, either to work or to live. Elsewhere in the rest of the world, whether it's in Germany or other parts of Europe, where they, over the past number of years, have seen an influx of people coming from the Middle East, coming from as far afield as parts of Africa, the conversation on migration has centered on whether those people can be integrated into European society, but more importantly, the ways in which nationalist politics has then informed how people that have migrated are regarded. Or whether it's in the United Mexican States, where the conversation about migration has really been led by the United States of America and the need to keep the people out, whether it's through words that they use or through the idea of constructing a wall that separates Mexico from the United States of America. Those are conversations that today we hope to have. We're extremely honored to host this event in partnership with the Embassy of Mexico here in South Africa. Mexico is also the co-chair of the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. We're honored to have the ambassador here with us, and we're also honored to have the ambassador of Switzerland, the other co-chair of the Global Compact, here at the seminar with us. But most of all, today you will hear from 3 speakers, all of whom are experts on various aspects of migration, whether it's from the American experience, the African experience, or the European experience. We hope that through the seminar, the conversation on migration is not just seen as a localized or a national issue, but is seen within its proper global context. We have Professor Jorge Schiavon from Mexico, who's an expert on U.S.-Mexico relations, but also very specifically on issues around migration from Central America as well as the North American states. We have Katembo Tasakana, who's a migration expert and analyst, and also works for Channel Africa through the Swahili radio station, based here in South Africa, but originally from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We have Dr. Melanie Müller from SWP, a German think tank who works specifically on issues related to Europe specifically, but also has a very particular interest on African research and studying some of the dynamics between both the African continent as well as Europe. So with our 3 presenters today, we will be able to hopefully have a full scope on what is the nature of global migration. What we will do in the seminar, we will have the public open discussion now, and at this point I would like to welcome our online audience who are tuned in, and after the discussion that we will have here, we will bid farewell to our online audience, and then we will have a closed roundtable type of discussion with the people who were fortunate enough to be able to make it to the ISS this morning, and for that, that will be closed and will not be live streamed. The seminar is a little bit unlike other seminars. We are not going to have presentations from the people that I will be speaking with today. We are going to talk through migration, and we're going to hear the varying perspectives. And so what I will do is I will ask a series of questions to the people that I'm speaking with today. They don't have the benefit of knowing what I'm going to ask them about. So it's kind of like agreeing to speak and then being tested. But I trust their expertise. They are people who work on migration issues at home and elsewhere. Before the seminar, we were having a brief conversation, me telling them that this is going to be the scariest moment of your life, but then talking about how all of us, in our various ways, are migrants. And looking at the people that have made their way to this seminar, I imagine that a lot of people in this room, if they haven't recently migrated, are products of various forms of historical migration. So it makes it a little bit easier, doesn't it, to speak on something that you are and that you know. So I'm going to start with you and Jorge, if I can call you Jorge instead of Prof. Skervan. At the moment in the Americas, what is the conversation on migration? Is it an easy conversation to have?
Well, thank you for the invitation. The biggest problem in North and Central America in terms of migration is that we don't have a conversation. We just have monologues, and that is the biggest problem. What we've seen in the course of the last year, especially with the Trump administration, is that Trump is trying to manage, not administer, but manage migration in an unilateral way. And the biggest problem with this is that it makes it very difficult to cooperate and actually find solutions for the biggest challenges we have in terms of migration. In order to actually be able to understand migration as a phenomenon, you have to get rid of your obsessions. And the biggest obsession we have, at least in the case of North America, is the United States thinking that migration is only immigration. That is, those people who come from other places into the United States. And on the other side, there's also a monologue from Mexico and from Central America, in which the obsession is emigration, those that leave our countries and go into other countries, especially to the United States. So what we have to find is a middle term there in which we actually see migration in a comprehensive way, and we understand that migration has at least four components, which are immigration, those that leave; immigration, those that come; migration in transit, those who come from one country through my country to a third country; and finally, returning migrants. And what we see in North America is that it has been changing dramatically in the course of the last decades. For almost 1 century, Mexico was a country of emigration, mostly 98.5% of them going to the U.S. Today, few people know this, but Mexican emigration to the U.S. net is zero. That is, more Mexicans are coming back into Mexico than those going into the U.S., mostly because of deportations. We've had over 3 million Mexicans being deported in the course of the last 10 years back to Mexico. And today, we still have a huge Mexican community in the U.S., 36 million people. From those, 12 million were born in Mexico. But the most important issue right now in terms of migration in the region is migration in transit. Mostly Central Americans coming through Mexico trying to go into the United States. And we're talking approximately of 450,000 people every year. And as you know, because it's been in the news in the course of the last weeks, we have a caravan right now of migrants from Central America through Mexico going into the U.S. But there's nothing new about this. Migration in transit has been going on for at least 15 years, and in year 2005, we already had 417,000 Central Americans crossing Mexico into the U.S. So this idea that this caravan will invade the U.S., oh, come on. There are 8,000 people, from a universe of 450,000 that cross every year. So the central reason why this became so public is because President Trump has a telephone and he loves tweeting. So he made this a political issue, an electoral issue, especially for the midterm election. So what I would say is, let's break these monologues and let's start a real conversation in which we can see migration from its different angles and perspectives, and if possible, also from a long-term perspective of at least a couple of years, hopefully a decade, because then we will really understand the phenomenon and not just concentrate on what's happening today at this specific minute.
Jorge says, let's move away from monologues. He's spoken for a little bit longer than I thought he would. Let's move away from monologues and let's have a dialogue, but let's have, beyond a dialogue, let's have as many actors as possible having the conversation on migration. I don't know how much Chancellor Angela Merkel tweets. I know it's far less than the President of the United States. But Melanie, from the German experience in talking about migration, is it a one-sided conversation, or is Europe having a conversation about migration beyond themselves?
Yes, thank you, Ottilia, for the invitation. First of all, I'm glad that our Chancellor doesn't have a Twitter account, which I think helps a little bit. No, to be honest, I think there is a debate in Europe, but the debate in Europe is disconnected from the realities. I just wrote a piece with one of my colleagues. We said the European Union acts in a crisis mode without having a crisis. Because if you look at the arrivals, for example, this year, they will remain below 150,000 people all over Europe, which is less than before the so-called refugee crisis or migration crisis in 2015. But the words that you very often hear in the debate are an invasion, a wave of migrants. It's the wording that matters, and it creates a lot of fears, I think. And it also prevents Europe at the moment to solve the challenges that we have in a more sustainable way, to actively, to really have an honest debate about the global compact on migration, to also speak about the responsibilities and the sharing of responsibilities with regard to the redistribution of migrants and refugees within the European Union. And I think it partly is because we don't have a migration crisis, but Europe is in crisis, like it's an identity crisis of Europe. And you said at the beginning that I work on European issues. I normally don't. I mean, I work at SWP on Southern Africa and West Africa, but in the past years, because of migration, because the problems that the European Union faces, and also domestic issues, foreign policy and domestic policy, or European policy, go together. So you cannot separate it anymore. We normally don't comment on domestic policies, but now you can't avoid it because it's so connected.
You said the debate is disconnected from reality. In a moment, we'll talk about what that reality is, and I think it's important that we also get that full picture of what that reality is from the European perspective, from the American perspective, and also from the African perspective. But before we go into that, and Katembo, I don't know how much you are on Twitter, but yesterday the executive mayor of the city of Johannesburg, in response to a tweet asking him not to kill small businesses after he had effected a citizen's arrest on a person that was selling beef on the streets of Johannesburg, responded, and I'll quote it: "We are going to sit back and allow people like you to bring us Ebolas in the name of small business? Health of our people first. Our health facilities are already stretched to the limit." Are we having a conversation here in South Africa, or aren't we?
Well, I think we're not having a conversation enough on what is the nature of migration in the continent, and more specifically for a country like South Africa, which has been receiving quite a number of migrants indeed, but the response from authority has not been quite well to talk about informed policies that respond actually to the actual need to contextualize the migration conversation in the country. And that's why the nature of the response that we get from Mayor Herman Mashaba and many other authorities in the country, and not only in South Africa, because it will be wrong for us to categorize this conversation as a typical Mayor Herman Mashaba's view, but there are many other Mashaba in different countries, especially for the case of the African continent. And that's why I would like to talk much more about the nature of migration on the continent and how it has happened. And Africa as a region is more divided, more about 4 to 5 regions. you have the North African regions, which are commonly known as the Maghreb. You have the West African region. You have the Horn of Africa and East African region. Then you have the Central African region, then the Southern African region. Each of those regions have a specific context in which migration are happening in those regions. Take, for instance, the north of Africa, the Maghreb region. You have the issue of Libya. Libya, before Muammar Gaddafi, was hosting about 2 million migrant workers working in petrochemical engineering and the refineries of that countries. So that served sort of a buffer zone for migrant labor to cross to Europe to look for better work. But still, Libya was a destination for migrants because it was deemed as a more stable among the Maghreb countries within Africa. Now, despite that, you have also other historical aspect to it. Much of the countries in the region were French colonies, so that sort of a paternalistic approach to colonizations also appealed to much of those people in the French-speaking countries to head towards countries like France. You have people migrating from Algeria going to France, in Tunisia, and so on. Now you have the West African. The West Africans are more about economic issues and more instabilities, but other critical aspect to the West African region and the Maghreb is that the environmental impact. Existing water bodies such as the Lake Chad and other rivers, the continuous expansion of the Sahel desertifications is displacing people. Therefore, agriculture, which is the backbone of Africa's many economies, gets strained because of the change of the weather. And that adds to people actually move for greener pasture. You have a case of Nigeria where the House and the Fulani fighting among each other, looking for pasture where to actually keep their cattle and so on. And that, people are constantly on the move, owing also to the historical context to it, because people have been moving on the continent. It's unfortunate that we're having a discussion on migration now, but this has been an existing phenomenon. Now you come to the Central African region. Totally, since 1990, you have a country like Rwanda, which faced genocide, much talked about, and almost close to 200,000 people crossing from Rwanda to eastern DRC. And immediately, no less than 2 years after the war broke out in Rwanda, another war breaks out in the DRC. Now, these are refugees. They have not returned back to their country. They have to get inside the Congo forest and going other parts of the country. So Congolese themselves are facing a war. You have the Central African Republic as well facing a war, the anti-Balak and the Seleka factor in that region. Then you have Cameroon, which also have another problem between the Anglophone and the English-speaking countries, and also forcing people in those regions to look for other ways where to live. So in the East African side, now you have a region like Somalia, which after the fall of Mohammed Siad Barre in 1990, you would remember the American intervention at the time in that country. The country has been stable since then. And almost, I would dare say almost every country on the world have a Somali refugee at the moment. You have just in the U.S., despite Trump's tweet, one of the Somali refugees who was in a Kenyan camp at Dadaab has just been elected to the United States Congress. So that shows you the nature of migration. And for the case of Southern Africa, much has been talked about in the Southern African region in terms of Zimbabwe, the collapse of the economy in that country, mismanagement of the political elite, leading to people searching for greener pastures coming to countries like South Africa. Now in Mozambique, just recently, the 2015 elections between Frelimo and Renam, there were problems, and that caused about 180,000 people to move from within the Mozambique and other moving outside of Mozambique. So, in a nutshell, Africa is a continent on the move, owing to its own nature of problems. And many of those problems are more structural. In as much as we can talk about the mismanagement of political systems in the different countries, but I think we are forgetting about the nature of the economic and the political structure around the world. Some of them are ideological in nature. You know, this started in the early 60s between, you know, the advent of the Cold War, just post the Second World War, the East versus the West, and that impacted on how the ruling governments are going to behave in different African countries. But also, adding to that, the economic structure. African government in the early 80s, with the advent of the economic structural adjustment program that were brought in by the International Monetary Funds, made it for even state arts and what the states were doing for its own citizen, abandoned that in favor of privatization that was, you know, promoted by the Bretton Woods system organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank. So this has put much pressure on the government. For instance, health issues. You had the tweet of Mayor Herman Mashava talking about bringing us Ebola. But these were core functions of the state which almost has been led to the private sector where the government cannot play any other role. So I will stop there just not to overburden our audience on what is going on here. Thank you.
In fairness to Katembo, Africa is a continent of at least 55 states. 55 of those are member states of the African Union, but there's a few other independent states that aren't. So it's very difficult to capture the extent of the varied movement on the African continent. But there's a couple of things, and there were some things that I think I'll go to you, Melanie, to respond to now, which relates to some of the structural issues or structural drivers of movement. But also, and I think the one thing we mustn't forget in a conversation about migration is that people make choices to move, whether they are forced to make the choice or whether it is a voluntary choice. At the end of it, people move. Some do not, but people do move. And so the ways in which policies are crafted and shaped has to respond to that reality. So turning quickly back to you, Melanie, in terms of what are some of the policy frameworks at the moment that are dealing with migration. I know, for example, in Germany, you have a rather two-track system in terms of those people who are entitled to seek asylum and get refugee status, and then those that are economic migrants that then are employed into the system, and then the visitors, as it were. So what are the policy frameworks from the European side on migration?
Yes, I would say we have then to move back to Africa because a lot what has happened in the past years is more an externalization of border management to African countries. We did a study, I brought it, it's called Profiteers of Migration, Authoritarian States in Africa and European Migration Management. And we looked at how Europe has different forms of cooperation with different African states, mainly in West Africa, also in East Africa, North Africa, to prevent migrants from coming to Europe. For example, I looked at Niger. I went to Niger last year, and I think it's pretty clear that most of the cooperation focuses on strengthening the security sector in Niger, Also, the EU, also GIZ, for example, helped to support the Nigerian state to implement a new law which criminalizes migration up to Libya and also to Algeria. And I mean, the IOM says that between 2016 and 2017, this decreased the number of migrants and refugees because it's mixed migration. We cannot always separate, so-called economic migrants from refugees. There are different reasons why people migrate. Decreased the number by 75%. Having said that, I think it's important to keep in mind that also different networks, smugglers have, moved into Niger and now take these migrants further up to Libya. So I think probably what happens is that you develop more different routes. And this also poses a threat to the stability of Niger, because a lot of people in Niger, especially in the region around Agadez, lived from migration. So earned their income, and now this has gone. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction with this situation. I think we're all aware also of the European cooperation with Libya, and that a lot of people are now sitting in Libya under very difficult conditions because they have been taken back. So I think this is something that we looked very critically at, because I think this is at the moment one of the solutions to externalize the so-called problem, right? Without really having to deal with the problem of, as I said, the responsibilities, and maybe finding a common framework within Europe to share the responsibilities, and to share the people that arrive and distribute them to different European states. So this is one of the things. And maybe if you allow me one sentence, at the moment there's the European Trust Fund, which is one of the most important instruments. And I think in the past years the European Trust Fund contained a number of very good projects with regard to development cooperation. So for example, like in Niger, supporting these people who lost their jobs now in the migration sector, as we call it. But a couple of European member states even want to move away from that and then have more support for security sectors, for more repressive measures on African borders, which I think will probably create even more problems, because then you don't address the developmental questions, which you just said are an essential part of the problem. So I think, and that's why I said, a lot of what is happening at the moment from a European level is happening outside of Europe.
Outside of Europe. Going back to the Americas, you mentioned, Jorge, that individual countries seem to have a particular focus on a particular part of migration. So for the United States of America, their policy is about inward movement. So it's about people immigrating into the United States and working to, keep them out or get them out, as it were. And that for a country like Mexico, a lot of it has been about immigration, historically anyway. But also the region has a lot of countries that are countries of transit, which Mexico is increasingly becoming a country of transit, but also people that are voluntarily returning and people that are forced to return. So how, in a situation like that of varied country positions, how do you imagine you can, let's start with North America only. Let's make it a little bit easier for you. So how can North America, or the North American states, how can they look towards, in any way or form, formulating a bit more of a coherent approach to migration?
That is a wonderful question, and it's a difficult one, because
I love difficult questions.
Because as you just said, there is a changing phase of migration in the region. And to start answering your question, we should start thinking of migration as a system. And that is, at least in the case of the Americas, we have three migration systems. The system that goes from Central America, the Caribbean, and North America. a second system which goes from Nicaragua all the way to Colombia and Venezuela, and then we have a third system in South America, and we have very different patterns of migration in each of them. But this has been changing dramatically in the course of the last 2 decades, and the best example is what you said, Mexico. Mexico was a country of emigration. We have 36 million Mexican people of Mexican origin living in the U.S. However, in the last 7 years, we have become a country of net immigration and mostly migration in transit, something that didn't happen 20 years ago. So, and also something that has changed dramatically in the Mexican cases, we didn't have returning migrants since the 1930s. And today we have over 3 million Mexicans returning either because they decided to or because they were deported. So this makes you have to change the way in which you analyze migration. And also, Mexico has become a country of immigration, something that hadn't happened in our history, at least since the end of the 19th century. So what can be done in order to have a coherent migration policy in the region? It's what I call the 4 C's of migration. In order to have a good migration policy in the system of Central and North America, you have to have coherence, you have to have cooperation, you have to have coordination, and you have also coherence, comprehensive, and cooperation and coordination. Let me explain each of them. First, coherence. Mexican case. How can we be able to ask the U.S. to respect the rights of Mexican migrants if we ourselves don't respect the rights of Central American migrants? So you have to be coherent in order to have the capacity of actually generating cooperation, which is the other C. The only way in which you can have a migration policy which actually takes into consideration the preferences of the different countries and actors is by cooperating amongst them. And in the case of Central and North America, we have created a mechanism which is the Commission of the Regional Commission on Migration, in which migration policies of sending, receiving, and transit countries are negotiated in order to find common ground. But you also have to be able to coordinate amongst these different members, especially within the countries. And at least what we see in each and every country in this system is that within the country, different ministers do not cooperate. And we see, for example, in the case of Mexico, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs doing a wonderful job in terms of protecting Mexicans abroad, but the Mexican Ministry of the Interior doing a terrible job in terms of receiving and treating humanitarianly the migrants from other countries. And finally, you have to be consistent. That's the final C. Consistent in terms of, yes, you need orderly migration, you need safe migration, you need to administer migration, but you should never forget we're talking about human beings. So you have to always remember that the human rights of these people should go before. So you have to be consistent between the rule of law, but at the same time making it from a human rights perspective. So the only way is by making these 4 C's of cooperation, coordination, and being consistent and coherent in terms of migration policy, not in North America and Central America, but practically in every region of the world.
Right. So I like that you ended there, because in every region of the world, Jorge says, be coherent, cooperate, coordinate, be consistent. And I suppose an additional 5th C that you kept sneaking in there is once you have all of those, you're able to have the right and comprehensive approach to the issues. So turning to the African continent, right? We've got the migration policy framework for Africa that has been developed at the African Union level. We have a common African position that deals with migration issues. And on the 28th of January this year, African Union heads of state agreed and adopted a protocol to the Convention on the African Economic Community, which seeks to advance freedom of movement, as well as later on freedom to reside and work where you go. But the first stage is freedom of movement. And this is being rolled out at sub-regional level, with SADC, for example, having a migration dialogue for Southern Africa. Is it, and I'm going to ask the question to you, Katembo, and maybe to you also, Melanie, is this comprehensive? Is it coherent, cooperative, coordinated, and consistent? Are we ever going to see freedom of movement on the African continent that is governed as such? Katembo. Sorry, difficult questions is my thing.
It is a difficult questions because in the case of Africa, there is a ambivalence in how policies are being implemented. Let's take the case of the East African community, which has been sort of taken the issue of migration at a more higher level in terms of integration. But if you look at East Africa, just about a year ago, Kenya expelled some Tanzanian migrants back to Tanzania. And Tanzania did expelled also some Kenyan who are working in Kenya as small-scale businesses, people. So that tells you that is the policy that the African Union is advancing on in terms of free movement of people, in terms of free movement within the regions, is not working. So the issues of coherence is not coming up here. The other aspect to the African migration, in this case, depending on each region you find yourself, is the increased securitization of migration. You have the case of South Africa here, where they said that just the recent concluded white paper on migration, which takes a different turn on how these migration policies are going to be implemented. So it becomes a challenge if, as a professor said, the lack of coherence in terms of policy implementation. Yes, we might have this nice paper and it talks on migration, but without having a coherent policy and implementation above all is what matters in all this discussion about migration. And unless government works up and understand that migration is an issue that is going to stay, because we have different economic policies that are happening. On the other hand, SADC want, Zimbabwe being a first trading partner of South Africa in the region, but still it doesn't want its people, for instance, to come this side. But even among the African borders, you find that by virtue of colonization, you have 2 million Botswana people in Botswana who are called as a nation, and you have over 5 million Botswana people in Botswana who are called as a tribe. So that tells you how much about the complications and much of the nuances that exist between the migration issues among the African countries themselves. Let's say, for instance, a few months ago, I went to the northwestern part of this country, northwest, called a border called it's in towards immediately after Rustenburg. I mean, you have people working on the Botswana side, coming to South Africa, visiting Angos, and going to those going from South Africa, spending the days in Botswana. So the question is, how do we manage this without necessarily victimizing people on the move, and harnessing actually the cooperation between the communities themselves, and making sure that policies seeks to actually implement the free movement of people as they have been talking at a higher level. Even the Pan-African Parliament in May this year, which sat in Midrand, talked about migrations and the free movement of people after the Kigali Declaration on on free trade. So it is really the lack of policy coherence and the policy implementations to make sure that they harness the benefits of migration. Yeah.
So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Katembo now just said, how do we manage migration without victimizing the migrants? Which I think is quite an important statement to make, because those are two things. Migration, which is a process that people can do, but also data can migrate if we're being pedantic. But then you've got the people, right? So how do you make sure that you've got a system in place that checks all the boxes, right? So let's not say that security is not a concern. We know that it is a concern. Let's not say that economic development is not a concern. We know that it is a concern. Or poverty or inequality or any of the range of issues that are in all of our various countries. How do we manage all of those? And I'm looking to Europe to give me the answer. How do we manage all of those without victimizing the migrants? Is it possible? Has anyone done it? Or if they haven't, what's the kind of framework that would be able to ensure that? I'm sorry, Melanie, they got difficult questions, so do you.
Yeah, this is a very difficult one. But maybe I would like to take a step back. I think the problem is at the moment that we don't acknowledge migration as a normal process, which, has been going on forever. Yeah, and that migration was there before there were national states and before we had borders. Like
what Katembo was saying, Botswana in Botswana and Botswana here in South Africa, for example.
For example, right? So I think before we don't acknowledge that, we cannot have let's say, a normal discourse without victimizing peoples that want to migrate. Interesting enough, if I come to South Africa, and I spend probably 2 to 3 months here each year, which makes me kind of a migrant, I would say, I don't get victimized. Why is that, right? Even though it's part of my job to come here and it earns me money in Germany, but still, And I think it has a lot to do with the perception. I think especially interesting enough, in 2015, 75% of the people who went to Europe came from 3 countries. It was Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. But a lot of the efforts since 2015 focus on sub-Saharan Africa and the terms invasion and the wave of migrants. If people speak about it, it's very often about sub-Saharan migrants. So I think there is an element of, it's racist perceptions and you have to talk about it. That is a problem. I think that sometimes also has to do with the fact that, if you look at press coverage in Germany, and also how we speak about sub-Saharan Africa, there's not enough information available, so there's very strange perceptions sometimes, some people might still think Africa is a country, which is, unfortunate. And then also, I think some of the pictures that we have don't necessarily help, like poor Africans, these are the terms that people use. And if you then, if I then speak in Berlin about Johannesburg, Pretoria, Ghana, like Accra, or big cities, and also what is possible in some rural areas, I think some people wake up and actually think that, there's a lot going on, and we could also benefit from having people from other regions here. But I think this is something that needs to change, and that we have all these right-wing movements at the moment in almost every European country who feed into this sentiment, and these perception doesn't necessarily help. You asked me for positive answers, and I have to say I'm not very optimistic at the moment, because it is frustrating how we discuss that issue of migration and how we speak about others at the moment. But that's all we can do, right? To maybe turn this around. And you're probably aware that 4 weeks ago, 250,000 people demonstrated in Berlin with the hashtag indivisible, which means we're all united, we're together, and we want people to come and integrate them, and I think that is important. Maybe if you allow me one sentence for Germany, what I think we sometimes forget is that before the Holocaust, we had a lot of migrants living in Germany before our genocide, you know? And I think after that, it seems to be that Germany was a more homogeneous society, but it wasn't. It wasn't. And I think sometimes looking at history and also reflect about migration, I think, and tell a different story, create a different narrative. I think this could be one, you know, of the things to maybe develop a different perception.
Yeah.
So
So
there is something on this because
Of course,
it was
yeah.
a wonderful question, and what we need to do is change the conversation,
Yeah.
and the only way in which we could do that is through information.
Yeah.
Just hard, cold data.
Yeah.
Let me give you some hard, cold data about this huge crisis of migration in the world. Well, there's no such crisis. We're talking about only 257 million people, which are 3% of global population. And what's also important to say is that over 80% of these migrants are regular migrants. Less than 20% are irregular. And also what's important to know is that even if they're only 3% of the global population, they produce 9% of GDP. So that means they're the most productive people on earth. And also what's even more interesting here in terms of hard, cold data is that 90% of all the wealth created by these migrants stays in the countries of destination. Only 10, somewhere between 8 and 11%, it depends on the countries, goes back to the countries of origin. So who are the ones who benefit most from migration? Obviously, the countries of destination. So if we change the conversation through data, which shows that actually migration, the most of the time, for most of the people, for most of the countries, for most of these migration systems is positive, then we might start changing the consciousness of the different societies, and especially even these groups to the center and to the right of the spectrum who are becoming increasingly xenophobic and racist.
If I may add one figure, just
Yeah.
because we looked at it, EU citizens think that migrants from outside the EU make up 16.7% of the EU
can
population.
you repeat that?
EU citizens think that migrants from outside the EU make up 16.7% of the EU population. But fact is that they only represent 7.2% of the EU population. And I mean, this is a mismatch, which is very interesting.
Yeah. So both of you, you've touched on two things.
I think just to add to the conversation of this, you have a case of EU talking about migration crisis and labeling it as a crisis, but which is, you correctly said, it's not a crisis. I would give one particular example of a country such as Uganda, which is in East Africa. It just did recently a census on the total of migrant refugees fleeing conflict, not economic migrants, but those fleeing conflict. There were about 1.1 million that were registered by the government. Kenya have about 480,000 migrants from Somalia alone. That excluding other countries such as Burundi, in the refugee camps such as Kakuma in the far north of the country. So I think the problem here is Doctor, as he correctly said, is the data, hardcore data to show the evidence that actually what people are terming as a crisis is not actually a crisis, but we should rather have a conversation on how we manage migration. In the case of migrants going to the Europe, I mean, you would be surprised that much of the migration that happen on a continent are inward migration. African countries are receiving more migrants than European countries. And yet, the narrative has been twisted to show that maybe Europe is receiving more migrants than the African countries themselves. I mean, the case of Mali, for instance, immediately after the outbreak of the Tuareg War, there was about 402,000 migrants that came out of that crisis, but almost all of them went to countries such as Ivory Coast, Senegal, Burkina Faso, they didn't go to Europe. And yet, the 150,000 that are coming from the Middle East and migrating to Europe, albeit through circumstances that were not even of their own making, are called a crisis. So this is where the conversation actually should be happening. What are we doing? And even policymakers, in terms of how some of the crises happen, such as the Syria. I mean, it started as some people rebelling against their own government, or before we know it, it's Russia involved, it's Iran involved, it's Israel involved, it's the United States involved. So that also speaks to what I said earlier. The geopolitical and economic system that the world is living today need to be rethink on how it responds to issues such as migration, and actually also being part of the cause of why people are on the move in a country such as Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, and many other conflict zones, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, where you have geostrategic issues playing out between big power, and eventually it's the local population who face the brunt and being forced to move out of their countries.
Thank you, all three of you. You've touched on a range of issues. Melanie, you brought into the fold the issues around racism, antagonism, and xenophobia. And basically, at the heart of it is, I suppose, the fear of the unknown. And Jorge, you then said what we need to do is to know. We need the right information, we need the accuracy of the data, but also, not least because that's the tool that you can be able to use to counter misperceptions. Katembo, earlier you opened with, we need informed policies, we need evidence, right? And what I'm getting from all three of you is pretty much the same thing. There is a lot that we don't know, but the parts that we do know really, in many ways, dispel a lot of the myths, whether it is here within the South African context on some of the xenophobia, some of it has flared up into violence that is informed by particular myths. The question is, and this is a question not just to the three of you, you're lucky, but it's a question to everyone here in the room and everyone that's tuned in online, which is, how do you use accurate information in an era of, and I will quote the President of the United States, fake news, even if he uses it incorrectly. In an era of misinformation, and we know the role that misinformation can play in destruction, whether it's ultimate propaganda, as it were, or simple acts of misinformation, how do we change that? And I know we're having this conversation, and we're speaking now in just under a month before states go to Marrakesh to negotiate essentially the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration. A lot of the things that you've raised already, the need for data, the need to ensure that the adverse drivers of forced movement, that those are mitigated, that those are reduced, that the risks and vulnerabilities that people on the move encounter, not just when they get where they're going, but when they leave and when they're in transit. The many risks and vulnerabilities that they encounter, but also some of the legitimate concerns, because I think we mustn't dismiss real concerns that states raise about the inability to effectively manage migration. When people speak about a migration crisis in Europe, I'm always the first in the room to say the crisis is not migration. The crisis is an inability to manage, to govern migration. Where you are unable to respond quickly, effectively, and in the long term, it becomes a crisis. If a fire burns and you're able to take it out, fire isn't a crisis. But if it gets worse, it does become it. So how do you respond to real concerns that individual countries are raising? But then also, how do you have a framework that enables conducive, that creates the conditions that are conducive to safe, orderly, and regular migration. It can't be that Agadez in Niger becomes the capital of smuggling in Africa. It can't be. That's a country where the median age is 13. It cannot be that people do not have the right access to the formal economy, that they resort to smuggling and trafficking of people. It most certainly can't be that in North America, the countries that themselves have historically been countries of destination, of departure, close themselves out, or nations built on migration close themselves out to the people that can build those nations. It simply, for me, it simply can't be. My last thing before we go into the discussion with the people that are here is knowing what the Global Compact says about migration. Knowing that states were so hard-pressed to have a short document. I'm glad that in your C's there was nothing there about succinct, which starts with an S, but anyway. Curt. There was nothing there about the policies need to be curt. Because my goodness, the Global Compact is not a short document. But you're dealing with over 200 states that are dealing with a particular issue that needs to be managed. The fact that there are 23 key areas and recommendations within the document speaks to trying to narrow it down. What I'm going to ask the three of you is I'm going to ask, I know which one is already your most important. You've said it. You've already said that there's a gap in data, there's a gap in information. So don't say that. After that, after the lack of information, what from the Global Compact speaks most to you?
For me, it's another C, co-responsibility. And the nice thing about this Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration is for the first time in history, we have an international mechanism which makes all countries in the world, be it countries of origin, transit, destination, or returning migrants, being co-responsible in finding solutions to administer and create governance on migration. It was mostly thanks to the facilitation of Switzerland and Mexico that we were able, of course I have to say that, because Mexico historically has used international organizations to further those issues which are important in terms of domestic policy and our foreign policy. And clearly migration is one of the central issues for Mexican foreign policy. So it is co-responsibility. It is also comprehensive in the term that it's safe, orderly, and regular migration. And you said it perfectly. Not only do we have 23 objectives with concrete implementation actions, but we have follow-up and review. So then we will know which countries are doing their job right, who are not, and how, based on that information, we can do better. There's only one big problem, and that is that not all the countries in the world will be signing this Global Compact. And so far, we know that the United States, Hungary, Poland, Austria, and I heard today the Czech Republic are not signing. So we see a new wall in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and it is of those countries which don't want to be part of the solution, but might be part of the problem in terms of how to generate governance in migration and in world affairs.
What a pity. Katembo, for you, from the Global Compact, what sticks out the most?
For me, what sticks out most for me is the issue of economic aspect, economic cooperations in trying to deal with the issue of migrations, and speaks about the corporate social responsibility that actually corporate companies have towards the people in terms of job creations. Because once you you earn a living, it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in the DRC, whether you're in Uganda, as long as you are making it where you are, it becomes difficult for you even to think of moving, because already you are earning an income that seeks to actually stabilize your life wherever you find yourself. The other aspects is the issues of respect for rule of law and human rights, governments. But let me talk about more specifically about corporate responsibility. With the globalization, the emergence of globalization in the 1990s, you have, and the advent of technology, you have an era where actually capital can move at the fingertips while we're sitting in this room.
And people can't.
But yet, people can't move. And that poses a challenge. So you have a massive corporations moving from one country. I remember, I am myself I'm a product of migration. I left my countries when I was barely 13 years old. I'm now here in South Africa. But I remember a company like Teltec, which is a call center company, opening in Cape Town. And after a year or two, it closed the offices and moved to other countries because maybe they couldn't see the reason why. Maybe the cost of doing business in South Africa was not. Did they move with the people that they were employing at the time?
No.
Certainly not. So that have an impact on those who were working for the company. So we need to rethink of the global business structure, the global economic structures in order to respond to the issue of migrations. If capital is being allowed to move, so be it. Let even labor be allowed to move freely. And I think that that would be easing the tensions, because regardless of whether we erect walls, whether we send helicopters to guard the Mexican U.S. border, people will always be on the move.
Melanie, for you, and you can't say what they've said.
No, normally if you, at the moment at least, if you say things like we've just said in Germany, very often people call you naive, right? Because they say, do you want open borders and everyone just comes in and so on? And I say, no, that's not the point, I think if I were to develop a vision for, let's say, 2050, I think it would be ideal if we had a situation in which people have a right to stay and the possibility to stay if they want to stay and they don't, they are not forced because of a war or because of their economic situation, but at the same time if they had the right to move. And I find it interesting that very often people who want globalization want trade and they want everything, but they don't want migration, which is part of globalization. I mean, it's naive to think that you can have globalization without having people moving and working in different regions. You don't ship goods from A to B, you need people to do that. And I think that's why I think that a couple of elements in the Global Compact are very valuable, because it would help us to find a way to have more regular ways of migration. We can also register people then, we know who comes in, which helps. We can give them, support them to integrate, because I mean, we see that in Germany, of course that is a task, and I mean, we speak of refugees, but same goes for migrants, like we have to integrate people, and we all know bureaucracies are always complicated, so I think this is one of the elements which is part of the Global Compact. So I think this for me is a chance to support countries who want to do that. It is a chance to support migrants, speak of human rights violations, and the point is, before the implementation of the law in Niger, because you just said that, people were not smugglers. A lot of them were transporters.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now they're smugglers. They're being pushed into illegality. So, and we all know from different other political areas that if you push someone into illegality, it becomes more difficult to control it. So, why not having a global instrument to enable us to do that?
Thank you. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Katembo. Thank you, Jorge. I think from your interventions so far this morning, you have captured some of the key elements of the global discussion on migration. And I think in many ways thought-provoking, because there's sometimes things that we don't necessarily think about out here in the southernmost part of Africa, thinking and investing in what is happening in North America and Central America is not something I imagine that most people do. But the similarities and the ways in which the issue is being dealt with over there informs the way that we then can be able to help craft and shape policies. And whether it's Europe externalizing, as you put it in your words, migration management to the African continent, there does need to be some critical reflection on that. And what tools are available to us, whether at a national level, at a regional level, continental and global, that can help us to be able to answer some of the critical questions that you've raised, but also to respond to some of the key concerns that you've raised. That's a C, but we're not dealing with that one for now. And how can those policies, Jorge, and I'm going to use this everywhere I go, and I'm not going to quote you, so people will think I'm the smart one. How can the policies and the frameworks be coherent? How can they reflect cooperation between internally the different government departments, externally with other countries, regionally, globally, and otherwise? How can they be coordinated such that it's not a waste, not just of time, but of money and human resources? And how can they be consistent, right? And I think for me, great takeaway there. And there's a lot for us on the African continent that we can learn from the different regions. So I appreciate both of you being able to get here without needing visas.
Actually, I needed a visa.
I said this one. I did. You will talk.
But interesting enough, I came 2 times, right? I came on last week from Germany. I got a visa for 3 months. Then I went to Zimbabwe and came back, and they only gave me a visa for 1 month because I came in from Zimbabwe, which speaks a little bit to the question of how easy it is for SADC.
It's easier for a German to move in Africa than it is for an African. And it's a point of critical reflection.
Yeah,
and we need to have that conversation, right? But importantly, Katembo, you said it. How do we manage migration without further victimizing migrants? How do we ensure that it is safe, that it is orderly, that it is regular? Is the global compact the silver, golden, platinum, we are in platinum country, bullet to do that? Perhaps not, because all that it is a document. But it speaks to 23 key objectives that, supposing people stick to them, supposing they're committed to them, and supposing they use them as the tools they need for the kind of sustainable development we need globally, not just locally, then it is an instrument, it is a tool that can be used. On its own, sitting on someone's desk, it's nothing. But if countries work to ensure the right data is there, the right information is there, the frameworks are there to protect people, not migrants, to protect people, including people on the move. That I can decide that I want to go, and I can right now because I'm a citizen of the Southern African Development Community, so I can go to the Kingdom of Eswatini, I can go to Lesotho, I can go to Zimbabwe to visit, perhaps not to stay. That ultimately, once you're able to facilitate safe, orderly, and regular movement, that the next phase is that people who do want to stay are able to do so in safe, secure, and stable environments. So not just going because you're fleeing conflict, not just settling in a country because maybe this is where I'll be able to earn something, legally or illegally, but that people are free to move. Because I suppose that's what freedom of movement ultimately means. So, Jorge, Katembo, Melanie, I want to thank you for the time that you've spent so far. We do still have a discussion after this, but for your commitment to this topic and for elucidating some of us who don't know that much about other regions of the world. I'd also like to thank the Embassy of Mexico, the ambassador who made her way here, but who also helped us to organize this event, for making migration a priority, not just for your country, but a foreign policy priority, and committing to that. And the Ambassador of Switzerland also for doing just the same, and co-facilitating a process that I imagine was not easy to co-facilitate, but doing so anyway, and hopefully leading more than 190 countries to Marrakesh in December, to be able to have that conversation and to be able to adopt an instrument that can then be used as a tool towards global, safe, orderly, and regular migration. I'd also like to thank the Hans Seidel Foundation, without whose money we would not have been able to host this event. We are grateful to them as a donor of the Institute for the work that we do on migration, but also on the other areas of work that we cover. We are also eternally grateful for the great support that we receive from members of our ISS Partnership Forum that include the European Union, the governments of Australia, Canada, the kingdoms of Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, as well as Norway, Finland, Ireland, and the United States of America, who hopefully will be just as committed to engaging with the ISS on various areas of work as they should be on the issue of migration, as well as the issue of ensuring that if you're able to deal with migration, hopefully you can be able to ensure sustainable societies that are developed. And most of them, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, the United States, are built on migration. So thank you to our online audience. I bid you farewell.